When it comes to brilliant minds that changed everything, Aristotle is basically the ultimate intellectual heavyweight. This guy lived over 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece. But he's still influencing how we think about literally everything today. Dante called him the master of those who know, and honestly, that's not an exaggeration. Aristotle didn't just dabble in one subject, he completely revolutionized logic, ethics, politics, biology, physics, psychology, and even poetry. Think of him as the original Renaissance man, except he came way before the Renaissance. He built this incredible system of knowledge that was so comprehensive and well thought out that for the next 24 centuries, every major thinker either built on his ideas or spent their careers trying to prove him wrong. Either way, they couldn't ignore him. We're talking about a mind so sharp and systematic that he basically created the blueprint for how we organize knowledge and think about the world around us. To comprehend Aristotle is to witness the emergence of systematic philosophy as a discipline distinct from poetry, mythology, and mere speculation. Where his predecessors had offered brilliant insights scattered like gems across diverse texts, Aristotle constructed a philosophical edifice of breathtaking comprehensiveness, where logic serves as the instrument of knowledge, metaphysics as the science of being qua being, ethics as the art of human excellence, and politics as the crown of practical wisdom. His works, surviving as lecture notes transcribed by devoted students, bear the unmistakable stamp of a mind that refused to accept the boundaries between disciplines, seeing instead the underlying unity that connects the study of syllogisms to the analysis of constitutions, the investigation of animal behavior to the theory of tragic poetry. The historical circumstances that produced this extraordinary figure were themselves extraordinary. Aristotle lived through the twilight of the classical polis and the dawn of the Hellenistic age, when Alexander's conquests would spread Greek culture from Egypt to India, carrying with them the intellectual tools that Aristotle had helped to forge. Born in 384 BCE in the small city of Stagira on the Chalcidice Peninsula, he was the son of Nicomachus, court physician to Amyntas III of Macedon, a connection that would prove fateful in linking the philosopher's destiny to the royal house that would reshape the ancient world. At the age of 17, Aristotle journeyed to Athens and entered Plato's academy, where for 20 years he would absorb and ultimately transform the Platonic heritage. The academy was no ordinary school, but a community of inquiring minds dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom through dialectical investigation and mathematical demonstration. Here Aristotle encountered not merely Plato's teachings, but the living tradition of Socratic questioning, the rigorous methods of geometric proof, and the conviction that philosophy constituted the highest form of human activity. Yet even as a student, Aristotle displayed the independent judgment that would later lead him to construct his own system in conscious opposition to key Platonic doctrines. The relationship between Aristotle and his teacher has fascinated scholars for centuries, embodying as it does the eternal tension between intellectual inheritance and creative rebellion. Where Plato sought reality in a transcendent realm of eternal forms, Aristotle would locate it in the concrete substances of this world, analysed through the lens of his revolutionary concepts of form and matter, potentiality and actuality. Where Plato distrusted sensory experience as a source of illusion, Aristotle would champion careful observation as the beginning of genuine knowledge. Where Plato envisioned philosopher kings ruling through wisdom alone, Aristotle would develop a nuanced theory of constitutional government that balanced the claims of different social classes. The Athens into which the young Aristotle was inducted in 367 BCE was a city still basking in the afterglow of its golden age, though the political supremacy of the 5th century had given way to a more complex international order dominated by the rising power of Macedon. The academy, founded by Plato some 20 years earlier, stood as a beacon of intellectual excellence in a world increasingly torn by warfare and political upheaval. Within its groves and lecture halls, a select group of students engaged in the kind of sustained philosophical investigation that had been pioneered by Socrates and systematized by Plato into a comprehensive vision of reality, knowledge, and virtue. For 2 decades, Aristotle immersed himself in this intellectual environment, mastering not only Plato's written dialogues, but participating in the oral traditions of philosophical debate that formed the heart of academy life. The influence of this formative experience cannot be overstated. From Plato, Aristotle inherited his commitment to systematic investigation, his conviction that philosophy must address the deepest questions about reality and human existence, and his belief that intellectual activity represents the highest form of human flourishing. The very structure of Aristotle's mature system, its division into theoretical, practical, and productive sciences, bears the unmistakable imprint of Platonic architectonic. Yet even during his academy years, Aristotle was developing the critical faculties that would eventually lead him to reject fundamental Platonic doctrines. His early works, now lost to us, apparently included dialogues written in the Platonic manner, but they also contained the seeds of his distinctive approach to philosophical problems. Where Plato had sought to transcend the world of sensory experience in pursuit of eternal truths, Aristotle was already showing his characteristic interest in the detailed study of particular phenomena. Where Plato had treated mathematics as the royal road to philosophical insight, Aristotle was developing his lifelong fascination with biological observation and classification. The academy during Aristotle's residence was no monolithic institution, but a lively centre of diverse intellectual currents. Besides Plato himself, Aristotle encountered such figures as Eudoxus of Cnidus, the great mathematician and astronomer whose work on proportions would influence Aristotle's later treatment of justice and friendship; Speusippus, Plato's nephew and eventual successor as head of the academy; and Philip of Opus, who may have been responsible for preserving some of Plato's final thoughts on law and politics. This rich intellectual environment provided Aristotle with exposure to the full range of problems that would occupy him throughout his career, from pure mathematics to political theory, from natural philosophy to ethics and aesthetics. When Plato died in 347 BCE, the academy passed not to Aristotle, despite his 20 years of residence and obvious intellectual distinction, but to Speusippus, whose philosophical orientation was more purely mathematical and less congenial to Aristotle's increasingly empirical interests. This disappointment, combined perhaps with rising anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens following Philip's victories over the Greek city-states, prompted Aristotle to leave Athens for the first time since his arrival as a student. He would spend the next 12 years in travel and teaching that would profoundly shape both his philosophical development and his historical destiny. The significance of Aristotle's departure from Athens cannot be measured simply in terms of personal disappointment or political expediency. By leaving the academy, he freed himself from the intellectual constraints of Platonic orthodoxy and created the space necessary for his own systematic thinking to emerge. The works he would produce during his years of exile and wandering show clear evidence of his growing independence from Platonic assumptions, his increasing confidence in empirical observation, and his developing mastery of the logical and metaphysical concepts that would define his mature philosophy. The decade following Aristotle's departure from Athens reveals a philosopher in transition, moving from the theoretical heights of academy speculation toward the concrete investigations that would characterize his mature system. His first destination was Assos, a city on the coast of Asia Minor ruled by Hermias, a former academy student who had established a philosophical court that welcomed Platonic refugees from Athens. Here Aristotle spent 3 crucial years, not merely teaching and writing, but engaging in the kind of direct political experience that would later inform his analysis of constitutions and statecraft. At Assos, Aristotle formed both intellectual and personal relationships that would shape his remaining years. He married Pythias, Hermias' niece, and entered into close friendship with Theophrastus, the brilliant student who would become his successor and the inheritor of his philosophical legacy. More importantly for the development of his thought, Aristotle began the systematic observation of marine life that would culminate in his groundbreaking work on animal classification and behavior. The lagoon of Pyrrha, on the nearby island of Lesbos, where Aristotle spent 2 years following his stay at Assos, provided him with an unparalleled laboratory for biological investigation. These biological studies represent far more than a hobby or sideline in Aristotle's intellectual development. Through careful observation and dissection of hundreds of species, he was developing the empirical methods and theoretical frameworks that would revolutionize not only natural philosophy, but his entire approach to knowledge. The patient work of classification, the attention to functional relationships between parts and wholes, the recognition of developmental patterns within individual organisms, all of these became central features of his philosophical method, applied with equal rigor to logical analysis and ethical investigation. The political destruction of Hermias' regime by Persian forces and the execution of Hermias himself in 341 BCE provided Aristotle with a harsh lesson in the fragility of human institutions and the tragic dimension of political life. His moving poem in memory of his friend and patron reveals a man deeply affected by personal loss, but also strengthened in his conviction that philosophy must engage seriously with the practical world of politics and human relationships. The themes of friendship, virtue, and the mixed character of human fortune that dominate his ethical writings can be traced in part to these formative experiences of loss and loyalty. In 343 BCE, Aristotle received the summons that would alter both his own destiny and the course of world history. Philip II of Macedon, the brilliant military and political strategist who had unified Greece under Macedonian hegemony, invited Aristotle to serve as tutor to his son Alexander, then 13 years old and already showing signs of the remarkable intelligence and ambition that would make him one of history's greatest conquerors. The choice of Aristotle as royal tutor was no accident. Philip needed someone who could provide his son not merely with technical education, but with the broad philosophical and political wisdom necessary to rule the vast empire that Philip was already envisioning. The 3 years Aristotle spent at the Macedonian court, teaching Alexander alongside future kings Ptolemy and Cassander, represent one of history's most fascinating encounters between philosophy and power. What exactly passed between teacher and student during these years remains largely mysterious, since neither left detailed records of their interactions. We know that Aristotle prepared for Alexander an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, which the future conqueror would carry with him throughout his campaigns. We can surmise that the tutor introduced his pupil to the systematic study of rhetoric, ethics, politics, and natural philosophy. Most importantly, we can see in Alexander's later career evidence of the broad humanistic education that only Aristotle among contemporary thinkers was equipped to provide. The relationship between Aristotle and Alexander embodies both the promise and the tragedy of philosophical engagement with political power. On the one hand, never before or since has a philosopher enjoyed such direct access to world historical influence through the medium of education. The values of rational inquiry, systematic investigation, and respect for diverse cultures that Aristotle transmitted to Alexander would be carried by the conqueror's armies from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, creating the intellectual preconditions for the Hellenistic synthesis that would preserve and transmit Greek learning to subsequent civilizations. On the other hand, The ultimate failure of philosophy to moderate power is evident in Alexander's increasing megalomania, his adoption of Persian court practices that scandalized his Macedonian followers, and his treatment of Greek cities as subjects rather than allies. The execution of Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes, who had accompanied Alexander's expedition as official historian, but fell from favour for opposing the requirement that Greeks prostrate themselves before the king, symbolizes the inevitable tension between philosophical independence and political loyalty. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, he left behind an empire too vast for any successor to control, and a cautionary tale about the limits of philosophical education in constraining the will to power. Alexander's early death in 323 BCE marked not only the end of an empire, but the beginning of a new phase in Aristotle's career. The philosopher, now 55 years old and at the height of his intellectual powers, returned to Athens to establish his own school, the Lyceum, where he would spend the final 13 years of his life developing and teaching the system that we know today as Aristotelianism. The choice of Athens was both natural and risky. Natural because Athens remained the intellectual centre of the Greek world, risky because anti-Macedonian sentiment ran high following Alexander's death, and Aristotle's association with the Macedonian court made him a potential target for political persecution. The Lyceum, named for the sanctuary of Apollo Lyceus where it was located, represented a new model of philosophical education, one that reflected Aristotle's mature understanding of the relationship between theoretical investigation and practical application. Unlike the Academy, with its emphasis on mathematical demonstration and dialectical argument, the Lyceum was organized around the systematic collection and analysis of empirical data. Its famous library, perhaps the first research library in Western history, contained not merely philosophical texts, but collections of constitutions from Greek cities, chronicles of dramatic competitions, maps of the known world, and specimens of plants and animals from across the Mediterranean. The institutional structure of the Lyceum embodied Aristotle's conviction that genuine knowledge requires collaborative investigation sustained over long periods of time. Working with a team of assistants and advanced students, he organized research projects that were unprecedented in their scope and systematic character. The investigation of 158 constitutions from Greek and barbarian cities, of which only the Constitution of Athens survives, represented a new form of comparative political analysis. The compilation of records from dramatic competitions provided the empirical foundation for the theoretical principles elaborated in the Poetics. The systematic classification of animals, based on first-hand observation and dissection, established zoology as a genuine science for the first time in human history. The teaching methods employed at the Lyceum reflected Aristotle's mature pedagogical philosophy, which emphasized the gradual development of understanding through exposure to carefully organized sequences of problems and solutions. His extant works, which represent not finished treatises intended for publication, but lecture notes refined through years of classroom use, bear the unmistakable marks of this pedagogical approach. Complex arguments are built up step by step, with frequent summaries and recapitulations. Difficult concepts are introduced through familiar examples before being developed in their full theoretical sophistication. Potential objections are anticipated and addressed before they can derail the main line of argument. The intellectual atmosphere of the Lyceum during Aristotle's tenure was characterized by a unique combination of speculative boldness and empirical caution. Unlike the Academy, where mathematical relationships provided the paradigm for all genuine knowledge, or the emerging Hellenistic schools, where practical wisdom was sought through the cultivation of specific mental attitudes, the Lyceum pursued knowledge for its own sake while maintaining constant awareness of its practical applications. The same mind that could analyze the logical structure of demonstration in the posterior analytics could also investigate the reproductive behavior of sharks in the history of animals, or trace the development of tragic poetry from its origins in ritual celebration to its culmination in the works of Sophocles and Euripides. This integration of theoretical and empirical investigation reflected Aristotle's growing confidence in the power of human reason to comprehend the natural order in its full complexity and richness. Where Plato had taught that genuine knowledge required transcendence of the sensible world, Aristotle demonstrated that careful observation and analysis of particular phenomena could yield universal principles of the highest explanatory power. Where traditional Greek thought had sharp boundaries between the realms of necessity and contingency, nature and convention, theory and practice, Aristotle developed conceptual frameworks subtle enough to honor both the universal and the particular, the necessary and the contingent, the theoretical and the practical. The final years of Aristotle's life were shadowed by the same political turbulence that had marked his entire career. The death of Alexander had unleashed centrifugal forces throughout the Greek world, and Athens had joined the rebellion against Macedonian rule that followed the conqueror's demise. When the rebellion failed and a pro-Macedonian government was established in Athens, Aristotle found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His association with the Macedonian court, his friendship with Antipater, Alexander's regent in Europe, and his general identification with Macedonian interests made him suspect to Athenian democrats seeking scapegoats for their city's diminished status. In 322 BCE, charges of impiety were brought against Aristotle, echoing those that had led to Socrates' execution nearly 8 decades earlier. Rather than face trial, Aristotle chose exile, reportedly declaring that he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He withdrew to Chalcis on the island of Euboea, where he owned property inherited from his mother, and there he died in the following year at the age of 62. His final letter to Antipater speaks of illness and weariness, but also of continued intellectual activity. Even in exile and declining health, the philosopher who had devoted his life to understanding the natural order continued his investigations until the end. To understand Aristotle's revolutionary contribution to human thought, we must begin where he himself began his mature system. With logic, the science he regarded not as one discipline among others, but as the indispensable instrument for all genuine inquiry. The collection of his logical works, known since medieval times as the Organon, or tool, represents humanity's first systematic attempt to analyze the structures of reasoning itself, to map the territory where thought encounters reality and extract from that encounter the patterns that govern all valid inference. In creating the discipline of logic, Aristotle did something unprecedented in intellectual history. He made thinking itself an object of rigorous scientific investigation. The Organon opens with the Categories, a work that addresses the most fundamental question of all philosophy. What kinds of things exist, and how can language and thought successfully refer to them? Aristotle's answer, developed with characteristic precision and systematic thoroughness, is that everything that exists falls into one of 10 basic categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. This seemingly simple classification conceals a philosophical revolution of extraordinary depth and scope. By distinguishing substance from its various attributes, Aristotle grounded all subsequent Western thought in the conviction that reality consists primarily of individual things, particular men and horses, trees and stones, that persist through time while possessing various characteristics and entering into various relationships. The category of substance receives privileged treatment throughout Aristotle's system because it alone possesses independent existence. All other categories exist only as modifications or attributes of substances. There is no redness without red things, no movement without things that move, no relationship without things that are related. This metaphysical insight has profound implications for logic and language, since it means that all genuine predication ultimately refers to the relationship between substances and their attributes. When we say Socrates is wise or the horse is running, we are not merely joining words together, but describing real relationships that exist in the structure of reality itself. The logical implications of this metaphysical foundation are worked out systematically in the Prior Analytics, where Aristotle develops his theory of the syllogism, the form of reasoning that remained the cornerstone of logical education for over 2 millennia. A syllogism consists of 3 propositions, 2 premises, and a conclusion that follows necessarily from them. The famous example, "All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal," illustrates the basic structure that Aristotle analysed in exhaustive detail, showing how different combinations of premises yield valid or invalid conclusions according to precise formal rules. The genius of Aristotle's approach lies in his recognition that the validity of reasoning depends not on the specific content of propositions, but on their formal structure. Whether we are reasoning about men and mortality or about planets and their orbits, the logical principles remain the same. This insight made possible the development of logic as an exact science, with rules as precise and universal as those of mathematics. By abstracting from the material content of reasoning to focus on its formal properties, Aristotle created conceptual tools that would prove indispensable for every subsequent advance in systematic knowledge. The posterior analytics extends this logical analysis to address the conditions under which genuine scientific knowledge is possible. Building on the foundations laid in the prior analytics, Aristotle argues that scientific demonstration requires premises that are not merely true, but necessarily true, not merely general, but universal, and not merely credible, but better known than the conclusion they support. Scientific knowledge, in other words, must be grounded in principles so fundamental and self-evident that they cannot rationally be doubted, and from these first principles, all other truths within the science must be derivable through valid logical inference. This conception of scientific knowledge as a deductive system grounded in necessary first principles would dominate Western thought until the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Yet even today, when we have learned to appreciate the role of hypothesis, experiment, and statistical inference in scientific method, Aristotle's analysis retains extraordinary value. His recognition that explanation requires the identification of causes, his insight that scientific understanding involves grasping universal patterns that hold across particular instances, his emphasis on the importance of definition in marking out the proper subject matter of each science. All of these remain central features of sophisticated scientific thinking. The topics and sophistical refutations complete the Organon by extending logical analysis beyond the realm of strict demonstration to encompass the forms of reasoning we employ in contexts where certainty is impossible and probability must suffice. The art of dialectic, as Aristotle understands it, provides methods for analysing and evaluating arguments about disputed questions, while the study of sophistical refutations teaches us to recognise and avoid the fallacious reasoning that can masquerade as genuine argument. These works reveal Aristotle's keen awareness that human reasoning operates across a spectrum of certainty, from the demonstrative arguments of mathematics and metaphysics to the merely plausible arguments appropriate to ethics and politics. The logical principles developed in the Organon function throughout Aristotle's system as more than merely formal rules for combining propositions. They reflect his fundamental conviction that reality itself is structured in ways that make rational investigation possible and fruitful. the fact that we can reason validly from universal premises to particular conclusions reflects the fact that nature itself exhibits universal patterns instantiated in particular cases. The fact that scientific demonstration requires causal explanation reflects the fact that natural phenomena are intelligibly connected through relationships of genuine causal dependence. Logic and metaphysics, in other words, are not separate disciplines but complementary aspects of a single philosophical vision. The philosophical investigation that begins with logic in the Organon reaches its systematic culmination in the Metaphysics, the collection of treatises where Aristotle develops his mature analysis of being qua being and the principles that govern reality as such. The very title Metaphysics, coined by later editors to designate the works that came after the physics in their arrangement of Aristotle's writings, captures something essential about the relationship between these investigations and the rest of his philosophical system. Where physics studies beings in motion, ethics studies human beings in their social relationships, and biology studies living beings in their natural environments. Metaphysics studies beings simply insofar as they exist, abstracted from all particular characteristics except the fundamental fact of their reality. This first philosophy, as Aristotle himself calls it, addresses questions that arise inevitably whenever human beings engage in serious reflection about the nature of existence. What does it mean for something to be? Are there different ways or degrees of existing? What principles or causes are responsible for the existence of things? How can unity and plurality, permanence and change, universality and particularity be reconciled within a coherent understanding of reality? These questions had occupied Greek philosophers from the earliest times, but Aristotle was the first to develop systematic methods for addressing them and to show how their resolution provides the foundation for all other forms of knowledge. The central concept of Aristotelian metaphysics is substance, already encountered in the categories, but now developed with far greater precision and philosophical sophistication. Substance is what exists in the primary sense, individual things like particular men and horses, trees and stones, that serve as the subjects of predication and the bearers of attributes, but are not themselves predicated of anything else. The distinction between substance and attribute is not merely grammatical, but ontological. It reflects a fundamental difference in modes of being that constrains how we must think and speak about reality. Yet the concept of substance itself requires careful analysis, since there are different candidates for what should count as substance in the primary sense. In his early work, Aristotle was inclined to identify substances with particular sensible objects, but his mature reflection reveals that this view faces serious difficulties. If individual substances are compound entities consisting of form and matter, then which component, or perhaps which combination of components, deserves to be called substance proper? Form appears to have a better claim, since it accounts for what makes a substance the kind of thing it is, but matter seems necessary to account for the substance's particularity and its capacity for change. Aristotle's solution to this puzzle introduces one of his most profound and influential innovations, the theory of hylomorphism, according to which individual substances are compounds of form and matter, with neither component capable of existing independently, but both necessary for the existence of the composite substance. Form without matter would be a mere abstraction. Matter without form would be pure potentiality lacking any determinate character. It is only the union of form and matter in individual substances that produces the beings we encounter in experience, beings that are simultaneously universal and particular, permanent and changeable, intelligible and sensible. This hylomorphic analysis extends far beyond the resolution of abstract metaphysical puzzles to provide the conceptual foundation for Aristotle's entire philosophy of nature. In biology, it explains how individual organisms can maintain their identity through processes of growth, reproduction, and metabolism while remaining the same kinds of beings throughout their life cycles. In psychology, it accounts for the unity of soul and body in living beings, showing how mental and physical processes can be distinguished without being separated. In ethics, it illuminates the relationship between universal principles of virtue and their particular applications in the contingent circumstances of human choice and action. The theory of substance leads directly to Aristotle's analysis of the four causes, his systematic account of the different types of explanation required for complete understanding of any natural phenomenon. When we ask why something exists, or why it has the characteristics it possesses, we are implicitly asking one or more of four related but distinct questions. The material cause identifies the underlying matter from which the thing is composed. The formal cause specifies the structure or pattern that makes it the kind of thing it is. The efficient cause traces the process or agent responsible for bringing it into existence. And the final cause reveals the end or purpose toward which its existence and activity are directed. This fourfold analysis of causation reflects Aristotle's conviction that genuine explanation must be comprehensive, attending to all the factors that contribute to making things what they are. Reductive explanations that focus exclusively on material or efficient causes, while potentially useful for limited purposes, fail to capture the full intelligibility of natural phenomena. A complete account of why an oak tree grows in the way it does must refer not only to the material processes of nutrition and metabolism, but also to the formal principle that guides development toward the mature tree, and to the final cause that explains why this particular pattern of development conduces to the flourishing of oak trees in their natural environments. The analysis of causation culminates in Aristotle's proof for the existence of an unmoved mover, a being whose existence is required to account for the eternal motion that characterizes the natural world. Since everything that moves is moved by something else, and since an infinite regress of moved movers is impossible, there must exist a first mover that is itself unmoved. This unmoved mover cannot be a physical being, since all physical beings are subject to change and therefore require external causes for their motion. It must instead be pure actuality, a being whose very essence is activity, and whose activity consists in pure thinking, thought thinking itself in eternal self-contemplation. This theological dimension of Aristotle's metaphysics has been interpreted in many different ways throughout the centuries. Some see it as a genuine proof for the existence of God, comparable to the arguments later developed by medieval Christian, Islamic, and Jewish philosophers. Others view it as a merely hypothetical requirement within Aristotle's physics, needed to account for the regularity of celestial motions, but carrying no implications about the existence of a divine being in any religious sense. Still others see it as Aristotle's attempt to identify the highest form of activity toward which all natural processes are implicitly directed, the pure actuality that serves as the final cause of the entire cosmic order. The investigation of being qua, being developed in the Metaphysics, provides the conceptual foundation for Aristotle's philosophy of nature, elaborated primarily in the physics and the specialized treatises on cosmology, meteorology, and biology that constitute his comprehensive account of the natural world. Where metaphysics abstracts from the particular characteristics of beings to study them simply insofar as they exist, physics focuses on beings insofar as they are subject to motion and change. This difference in perspective does not represent a division between separate realms of reality, but rather different levels of analysis applied to the same fundamental phenomena. The physics opens with a characteristically Aristotelian move, the identification of principles that must be presupposed by any adequate account of natural change. Since our most basic experience of the natural world involves encountering things that come to be and pass away, that move from place to place, that increase and decrease in size, that alter in quality, any philosophy of nature must explain how such changes are possible. The challenge is formidable, since change appears to involve the paradoxical notion that the same thing can both be and not be, can both possess and lack the same characteristics. Aristotle's solution draws on the metaphysical distinction between potentiality and actuality, one of his most profound and far-reaching innovations. Change is possible because beings can exist in a state of potentiality with respect to characteristics they do not currently possess, but might come to possess under appropriate circumstances. The seed is potentially a tree, the child potentially an adult, the student potentially knowledgeable. Change occurs when what exists potentially becomes actual through the influence of something that already possesses in actuality the characteristic toward which the change is directed. This analysis resolves the ancient puzzles about change that had troubled earlier philosophers, while preserving both the reality of change and the intelligibility of the natural world. Against Heraclitus, who had emphasized the universality of flux to the point where stable knowledge seemed impossible, Aristotle maintains that change occurs according to regular patterns that can be understood and predicted. Against Parmenides, who had denied the reality of change in order to preserve the consistency of logical reasoning, Aristotle shows that change can be rationally comprehended through the proper analysis of potentiality and actuality. The concepts of potentiality and actuality also provide the foundation for Aristotle's analysis of motion, which extends far beyond local movement to encompass all forms of change. Motion is the actualization of potentiality insofar as it remains potential, a formula that captures the distinctive character of motion as an incomplete actuality. When a house is being built, the building process represents the gradual actualization of the potential house that exists in the materials, the plan, and the builder's skill. The process continues until the potentiality is fully actualized in the completed house, at which point the motion ceases and is replaced by the stable actuality of the finished product. This understanding of motion as directed towards specific ends introduces the crucial concept of teleology, or final causation, into Aristotle's philosophy of nature. Natural beings do not move randomly, but according to patterns that seem directed toward the realization of their characteristic ends or goals. Plants grow toward maturity, animals seek food and reproduction, heavy objects fall toward the center of the earth. All of these represent natural teleological processes that can be understood only by reference to the ends they serve. The teleological character of natural motion provides Aristotle with the key to understanding the large-scale structure of the cosmos itself. The universe forms a hierarchy of beings arranged according to their degree of actuality and their proximity to the divine source of all motion. At the bottom of this hierarchy lie the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, whose natural motions are rectilinear and finite. In the middle lie the complex substances composed of these elements, including plants, animals, and human beings, whose motions exhibit increasing degrees of complexity and self-direction. At the top of the hierarchy lie the celestial bodies, whose perfectly circular motions reflect their composition from a fifth element that naturally moves in the most perfect possible way. This cosmic hierarchy reflects Aristotle's conviction that the natural world exhibits an intrinsic order that makes scientific investigation both possible and rewarding. The regularity of natural processes, the hierarchical organization of natural kinds, the teleological direction of natural changes, all of these features of the world as we experience it follow from the fundamental principles of potentiality and actuality, form and matter, efficient and final causation. Physics reveals the natural world to be neither a random collection of unrelated phenomena nor a mechanical system operating according to purely quantitative laws, but an organic whole whose parts are intelligibly related through their common orientation toward actuality and perfection. The biological works represent Aristotle's most detailed application of these general principles of natural philosophy to the investigation of particular phenomena. Through systematic observation and dissection, he identified and described more than 500 species of animals, organized them into a hierarchical classification system based on their modes of reproduction and degrees of organic complexity, and developed theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationships between structure and function, heredity and development, individual and species. These investigations were not merely empirical, but were guided throughout by the conceptual tools developed in his general philosophy of nature. The history of animals, parts of animals, generation of animals, and related treatises constitute the first systematic attempt in Western thought to establish biology as a rigorous science based on careful observation and logical analysis. Aristotle's method combined the detailed collection of data, much of it gathered through his own dissections and observations, with theoretical reflection designed to identify the causes and principles that account for the phenomena observed. The result was a body of biological knowledge that remained authoritative until the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and that still contains insights of permanent value for understanding the logic of biological explanation. The investigation of living beings that begins with classification and description in the biological works reaches its philosophical culmination in the De Anima, Aristotle's systematic treatise on the soul and its relationship to the body. This work addresses questions that remain central to philosophy of mind and psychology. What is the nature of life itself? How can we understand the relationship between mental and physical processes? What distinguishes different levels of psychological activity, from basic nutrition and growth through perception and memory to rational thought and deliberation? How can individual human beings participate in universal knowledge while remaining particular, material, mortal creatures? Aristotle approaches these questions through his characteristic method of beginning with commonly accepted beliefs and working through their implications to arrive at more precise theoretical formulations. Most people, he observes, recognize important differences between living and non-living things, and between different levels of living things, but they lack adequate theoretical frameworks for understanding these differences. The task of philosophical psychology is to develop concepts precise enough to capture these differences, while general enough to encompass the full range of psychological phenomena. The central concept of Aristotelian psychology is the soul, understood not as a separate spiritual substance temporarily united with the body, but as the form or organizing principle of a living being. The soul is to the body as shape is to wax, as cutting is to an axe, as vision is to the eye. Not a separate thing that could exist independently, but the actual exercise of the capacities that define what it is to be a living being of a particular kind. This hylomorphic analysis resolves many traditional puzzles about the soul-body relationship by showing that the question, how does the soul relate to the body, is based on a false assumption, like asking, how does the shape relate to the wax? Or, how does the cutting relate to the axe? The soul, as the form of a natural body that has life potentially, exists at different levels corresponding to the different capacities that characterize living things. The nutritive soul, possessed by all living beings including plants, is responsible for the basic functions of metabolism, growth, and reproduction. The sensitive soul, possessed by animals but not plants, adds the capacities for perception, desire, and locomotion. The rational soul, possessed by human beings alone among terrestrial creatures, adds the capacities for conceptual thought, deliberation, and scientific understanding. This hierarchical organization of psychical functions reflects Aristotle's general conviction that nature proceeds by degrees, with higher levels building upon and incorporating lower levels rather than simply replacing them. Human beings possess not only rational souls, but also sensitive and nutritive souls. Our capacity for abstract thought depends upon and builds upon our animal capacities for perception and desire. This integration of levels helps explain both the continuity between human beings and other animals and the distinctive characteristics that mark human beings as rational animals capable of science, ethics, and politics. The analysis of perception occupies a central place in Aristotelian psychology because it represents the crucial link between thought and reality, the process through which the external world becomes present to consciousness. Perception occurs when the sense organ receives the form of the perceived object without its matter, as wax receives the form of the signet ring without receiving the gold or silver from which the ring is made. This analysis explains how perception can be both subjective, occurring in the perceiver, and objective, revealing genuine characteristics of the perceived object. The 5 external senses, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, are unified by a common sense that enables us to distinguish between different sensory modalities, to perceive common sensibles like motion and shape that can be apprehended by more than one sense, and to be aware of perceiving itself. This unified perceptual activity provides the foundation for memory, which preserves past perceptions, and imagination, which can recombine elements from different perceptions to produce new synthetic images. The transition from perception to thought represents the most difficult problem in Aristotelian psychology, since it involves explaining how universal concepts can arise from particular sensory experiences. Aristotle's solution appeals to the active intellect, a capacity that abstracts universal forms from the phantasms or mental images that result from perceptual activity. The active intellect is not itself a separate substance, but rather the highest actualization of human rational capacity, the activity through which potential knowledge becomes actual knowledge. This analysis of intellectual activity has profound implications for Aristotle's understanding of human nature and human possibility. Human beings are capable of achieving a kind of immortality through intellectual activity, not because they possess immortal souls that survive bodily death, but because intellectual activity involves participation in eternal and universal truths that transcend the limitations of individual existence. When we understand mathematical theorems, scientific principles, or metaphysical insights, we are thinking thoughts that are in principle accessible to any rational being and that remain true regardless of our individual circumstances. The practical implications of this psychological analysis are worked out in detail in Aristotle's ethical and political philosophy. If human beings are rational animals whose distinctive excellence consists in the actualization of their intellectual capacities, then human flourishing must involve more than the satisfaction of bodily needs or even the achievement of social recognition. The highest form of human activity will be contemplation, the disinterested pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, while the moral virtues will represent the proper ordering of our animal capacities under the guidance of practical reason. The systematic investigation of human nature, developed in the psychological works, provides the foundation for Aristotle's practical philosophy, the branch of his system concerned with human action, character, and the conditions of flourishing life. The Nicomachean Ethics, named after Aristotle's son Nicomachus, who may have edited the work, represents his mature reflection on questions that had occupied Greek thinkers since the time of Socrates. What is the highest good for human beings? How should we understand virtue and vice? What is the relationship between individual excellence and social justice? How can theoretical knowledge guide practical decision-making without undermining the spontaneity and particularity that characterize ethical life? Aristotle approaches these questions through his characteristic method of beginning with widely shared beliefs and working through their implications to arrive at more adequate theoretical formulations. Most people, he observes, agree that happiness represents the highest good, but they disagree about what happiness consists in and how it can be achieved. Some identify happiness with pleasure, others with honor or recognition, still others with wealth or power. The task of ethical theory is to examine these competing conceptions and develop a more precise account that can guide practical deliberation and choice. The key to Aristotle's analysis lies in his recognition that happiness, properly understood, is not a feeling or a possession, but an activity. Indeed, the activity of living in accordance with virtue over the course of a complete life. This eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing, represents the actualization of human nature's distinctive capacities. Just as the function of a musician is to play music well, and the function of a physician is to heal, the function of a human being is to live well, and living well consists in the excellent performance of those activities that define human nature. The virtues, both moral and intellectual, represent stable dispositions to perform these characteristic human activities excellently. Moral virtues like courage, temperance, and justice are dispositions of character that enable us to act well in the various situations we encounter throughout life. Intellectual virtues like theoretical wisdom and practical wisdom are dispositions of mind that enable us to think well about theoretical and practical questions respectively. Both types of virtue are acquired through habituation and practice, rather than being innate gifts or theoretical insights. The analysis of moral virtue introduces one of Aristotle's most influential contributions to ethical theory, the doctrine of the mean. Moral virtues typically represent means between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice, which involves excessive fear, and rashness, which involves insufficient fear. Generosity is the mean between stinginess, which involves excessive attachment to wealth, and prodigality, which involves insufficient concern for the proper use of resources. This analysis helps explain why moral education requires more than theoretical knowledge. We must learn through practice and habituation to find the right amount of feeling and action in the particular circumstances we encounter. The doctrine of the mean should not be understood as advocating bland moderation or the avoidance of strong feelings and commitments. Aristotle recognizes that some actions and feelings are intrinsically wrong and admit of no mean. Murder, adultery, and spite are always vicious regardless of the circumstances in which they occur. The mean is relative to the individual and the situation. The amount of food that represents temperance for an athlete in training will represent excess for a sedentary scholar. The goal is not to eliminate passion, but to ensure that our emotions and actions are guided by practical wisdom and directed toward appropriate objects. The virtue of practical wisdom occupies a central place in Aristotelian ethics because it represents the intellectual capacity that enables us to apply general moral principles to particular situations. Unlike theoretical wisdom, which is concerned with eternal and unchanging truths, practical wisdom deals with the variable and contingent domain of human action. The person of practical wisdom has learned through experience to recognize what types of actions promote human flourishing in different kinds of circumstances, and has developed the judgment necessary to choose well when general rules conflict or when unprecedented situations arise. The relationship between practical wisdom and moral virtue is one of mutual dependence. We cannot possess genuine moral virtue without practical wisdom, since virtue requires knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to do it well. Conversely, we cannot possess practical wisdom without moral virtue, since practical reasoning about human affairs requires that our desires and emotions be properly ordered toward genuine goods rather than apparent goods. This integration of intellectual and moral excellence reflects Aristotle's conviction that human flourishing is not a simple or one-dimensional achievement, but involves the harmonious development of all our distinctive human capacities. The analysis of individual virtue leads naturally to consideration of friendship, which Aristotle regards as one of the most important components of a flourishing life. Human beings are by nature social animals who achieve their characteristic excellences only in relationship with others. The various forms of friendship, relationships based on utility, pleasure, or virtue, represent different ways in which individual flourishing can be enhanced through association with others. The highest form of friendship, based on mutual recognition of virtue and shared commitment to excellent activity, approaches the ideal of a community of rational beings united by their common orientation toward truth and goodness. The treatment of friendship reveals an important dimension of Aristotelian ethics that distinguishes it from many modern approaches. Its recognition that individual flourishing cannot be achieved in isolation, but requires supportive social relationships and just political institutions. The transition from ethics to politics is not a move from individual to social concerns, but rather a recognition that individual and social flourishing are ultimately inseparable. The person who attempts to achieve virtue in isolation from others will find that effort's self-defeating, while the community that fails to promote individual virtue will lack the foundation necessary for just and stable political life. The ethical investigation that reaches its provisional conclusion with the analysis of friendship and contemplation opens naturally into political philosophy, since human beings achieve their characteristic excellence only within political communities that provide both the material conditions and the educational opportunities necessary for virtuous activity. The Poetics, Aristotle's comprehensive treatment of political theory and practice, begins with the famous declaration that man is by nature a political animal, a statement that encapsulates his conviction that political life is not merely instrumentally valuable, but represents the natural fulfillment of human social capacities. This naturalistic approach to politics distinguishes Aristotelian political theory from both the conventionalism of the sophists, who treated political institutions as arbitrary human constructs, and the utopianism of Plato, who sought to design political communities according to abstract rational principles. For Aristotle, political communities emerge naturally from the human need for cooperation and mutual aid, but they achieve their full development only when they provide frameworks within which citizens can pursue the activities that constitute human flourishing. The analysis begins with the household, the basic social unit that brings together the relationships necessary for daily life: husband and wife for reproduction, parents and children for education and care, master and slave for economic production. While Aristotle's defense of slavery and his analysis of women's roles reflect the limitations of his historical context, his recognition that different types of relationship require different forms of authority remains insightful. The relationship between parents and children, for example, involves authority exercised for the benefit of those subject to it, and therefore resembles political authority, while the relationship between master and slave involves authority exercised primarily for the benefit of the ruler and therefore resembles despotic authority. The polis emerges when multiple households come together to form a community sufficient not merely for survival, but for the good life. Unlike households, which exist primarily to meet material needs, and unlike alliances, which exist primarily for mutual defense, the polis exists to promote the moral and intellectual development of its citizens. Political authority is therefore legitimate only when it serves this higher purpose and is exercised by those who possess the practical wisdom necessary to promote genuine human flourishing. The analysis of different constitutional forms occupies the central books of the Poetics and reflects Aristotle's characteristic attention to the diversity of actual political arrangements. Through systematic study of 158 constitutions from Greek and barbarian cities, Aristotle developed a typology that distinguishes correct constitutions, which serve the common good, from deviant constitutions, which serve only the interests of the rulers. Kingship, aristocracy, and polity represent correct constitutions suited to different circumstances, while tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy represent their deviant counterparts. This analysis reveals Aristotle's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political theory and political practice. While it may be possible to describe the best constitution in the abstract, actual political communities must be organized according to the material conditions, cultural traditions, and human resources available to them. The statesman's art consists not in imposing ideal blueprints on recalcitrant reality, but in working within existing constraints to achieve the best possible approximation to just and stable government. The discussion of democracy and oligarchy illustrates this practical approach to political analysis. Both constitutional forms rest on partial conceptions of justice that capture important truths while missing the complete picture. Democrats emphasize equality and argue that all citizens should have equal shares in political authority, while oligarchs emphasize merit and argue that those who contribute more to the community should receive correspondingly greater political privileges. Both arguments have force, but both become distorted when pressed to their logical extremes. Aristotle's solution involves the concept of polity, a mixed constitution that combines elements of democracy and oligarchy while avoiding the characteristic defects of each. Polity is characterized by the rule of the middle class, those citizens who possess sufficient property to be independent, but not so much as to be corrupted by luxury. The middle class provides the stability necessary for good government because its members have genuine stakes in the community's welfare, but are not so advantaged as to be indifferent to the concerns of other citizens. The analysis of law and its relationship to political authority reflects Aristotle's mature understanding of the conditions necessary for legitimate government. Law represents reason uncorrupted by passion, the crystallization of practical wisdom in institutional form. Where personal rule, even by excellent individuals, remains subject to the distortions of emotion and self-interest, the rule of law provides a framework within which authority can be exercised impersonally and predictably. Yet law cannot simply replace human judgment, since general rules must always be applied to particular circumstances by officials who possess the practical wisdom necessary to honor both the letter and the spirit of legal provisions. The educational theory developed in the final book of the Poetics brings together the insights of the entire work by showing how political communities can fulfill their ultimate purpose of promoting human flourishing. Education is the process through which potential citizens develop the intellectual and moral virtues necessary for excellent activity, and it therefore represents the most important function of political authority. A community that fails to educate its young people properly will lack the human resources necessary for just and stable government, while a community that succeeds in this task will produce citizens capable of both ruling and being ruled in turn. The integration of ethical and political analysis throughout Aristotle's practical philosophy reflects his conviction that individual and social flourishing are ultimately inseparable. Human beings achieve their distinctive excellence only within political communities that provide appropriate frameworks for virtuous activity, while political communities achieve their characteristic goals only when populated by citizens who possess the virtues necessary for intelligent participation in common life. This mutual dependence of individual and social goods distinguishes Aristotelian political theory from both individualistic liberalism, which treats political authority as merely instrumental to private ends, and collectivistic approaches, which subordinate individual development to social goals. The investigation of practical wisdom in ethics and politics leads naturally to consideration of rhetoric, the art of persuasion that enables citizens to participate effectively in the deliberative and judicial activities that constitute political life. The rhetoric represents Aristotle's systematic attempt to establish the legitimate scope and proper methods of persuasive discourse, distinguishing genuine rhetoric from sophistical manipulation, while showing how rhetorical skill can serve the cause of truth and justice. This work occupies a unique position in Aristotle's corpus, bridging the gap between theoretical and practical philosophy, while contributing to what would later be called the productive sciences. Aristotle defines rhetoric as the counterpart of dialectic, the art of finding in any given case the available means of persuasion. Like dialectic, rhetoric deals with matters that admit of different possibilities rather than necessary truths, and like dialectic, it provides methods for constructing arguments that are plausible rather than demonstrative. Unlike the sophists, who used rhetorical techniques merely to make the weaker argument appear stronger, Aristotle insists that genuine rhetoric serves truth by helping audiences recognize the most reasonable position among competing alternatives when certainty is impossible. The foundation of rhetorical theory lies in Aristotle's analysis of the three modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos concerns the character of the speaker as it appears through the speech itself, not the speaker's actual reputation, but the impression of trustworthiness, competence, and goodwill that the speech creates in the audience. Pathos involves the emotional dispositions of the audience that can be influenced through appropriate appeals to feelings like anger, fear, pity, or indignation. Logos encompasses the logical structure of the arguments presented, including both formal demonstration, where possible, and the more flexible forms of reasoning appropriate to practical affairs. This threefold analysis reveals Aristotle's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the complex factors that influence practical judgment. Purely logical arguments, however valid, will fail to persuade audiences whose emotional dispositions make them unreceptive to rational consideration. Conversely, appeals that rely exclusively on emotional manipulation without logical substance will prove ineffective with thoughtful audiences and may produce decisions that prove harmful when emotions cool and consequences become apparent. The treatment of emotional appeals in the second book of the Rhetoric represents one of Aristotle's most penetrating contributions to the understanding of human psychology. Through systematic analysis of emotions like anger, fear, confidence, shame, and envy, he shows how skilled speakers can influence their audience's emotional states by presenting situations in ways that naturally evoke specific feelings. This analysis is not cynical manipulation, but practical wisdom. Since human beings are not purely rational creatures, effective communication must take account of the full range of factors that influence judgment and choice. The discussion of logical reasoning in rhetorical contexts introduces the concept of the enthymeme, which Aristotle calls the rhetorical counterpart of the syllogism. Unlike scientific demonstrations, which proceed from premises known to be necessarily true, enthymemes work from premises that are generally accepted or plausible. Unlike syllogisms, which make all their premises explicit, enthymemes often leave one premise unstated, relying on the audience to supply the missing element from their own experience and common knowledge. This analysis of rhetorical reasoning illuminates important features of practical deliberation that formal logic alone cannot capture. When citizens debate policy proposals or juries evaluate evidence, they must work with incomplete information, competing probabilities, and value judgments that cannot be reduced to purely factual claims. The art of rhetoric provides methods for structuring such discussions productively, ensuring that relevant considerations are brought forward and that conclusions follow reasonably from the available evidence. The third book of the Rhetoric turns to questions of style and arrangement, showing how the effectiveness of arguments depends not only on their logical structure, but also on their presentation. Clear expression, appropriate metaphors, rhythmical prose, and strategic organization of material all contribute to persuasive power by making arguments more accessible to audiences and more memorable over time. These considerations reflect Aristotle's recognition that human beings are embodied creatures whose thinking is influenced by sensory and aesthetic factors, as well as purely intellectual ones. The integration of logical, psychological, and aesthetic considerations in rhetorical theory exemplifies the synthetic character of Aristotelian practical philosophy. Where purely theoretical sciences can abstract from the complexities of human experience to focus on universal and necessary truths, practical disciplines must remain attentive to the full richness of human motivation and the variable circumstances within which choice and action occur. Rhetoric serves the cause of practical wisdom by providing citizens with tools for participating effectively in the collective deliberation through which political communities pursue their common good. The investigation of productive sciences reaches its culmination in the Poetics, Aristotle's systematic analysis of poetry and its relationship to human nature and social life. This treatise, which survives only in fragmentary form, addresses questions that remain central to aesthetics and literary theory. What is the nature of artistic creation? How does poetry differ from history and philosophy? What accounts for the peculiar pleasure we derive from tragic representations? How can artistic works contribute to human understanding and moral development? Aristotle approaches these questions through his characteristic method of beginning with commonly observed phenomena and working toward theoretical explanations that can account for their distinctive features. The starting point is the recognition that human beings have a natural tendency toward imitation that manifests itself in various forms of artistic activity. Children learn through imitation, adults take pleasure in recognizing likenesses, and entire cultures preserve and transmit their values through mimetic representations in poetry, painting, music, and dance. The concept of mimesis, or imitation, provides the key to understanding both the nature of artistic creation and its relationship to reality. Poetry does not simply copy particular events as history does, nor does it abstract from all particularity as philosophy does. Instead, it creates probable or necessary representations of universal patterns of human action and experience. When Sophocles dramatizes the story of Oedipus, he is not merely recording historical events, but revealing through particular fictional incidents the universal human susceptibility to self-deception and the tragic consequences that can follow from acting on incomplete knowledge. This analysis of mimesis helps explain why poetry can be more philosophical than history, despite dealing with fictional rather than factual material. History is constrained by what actually happened and therefore remains tied to the contingency and particularity of specific events. Poetry is free to construct plots that reveal with special clarity the causal connections between character, choice, and consequence that operate in human life generally. Through this selective representation of probability and necessity, poetry provides a form of knowledge that is neither purely theoretical nor merely practical, but occupies a distinctive middle ground between universal principles and particular applications. The analysis of tragedy occupies the central portion of the surviving Poetics and reveals the depth of Aristotle's understanding of both artistic technique and psychological response. Tragedy is defined as the imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of appropriate magnitude, accomplished through language embellished with various forms of artistic ornament, presented in dramatic rather than narrative form, and achieving through pity and fear the catharsis of such emotions. Each element of this definition receives detailed analysis that shows how the formal features of tragic poetry serve its distinctive psychological and moral functions. The requirement that tragic action be serious ensures that the work will engage audiences with matters of genuine human importance, rather than merely entertaining them with clever displays of technical virtuosity. The requirement of completeness ensures that audiences will witness not merely isolated incidents, but connected sequences that reveal the logic of human action unfolding over time. The concept of catharsis, mentioned only briefly in the surviving text, has generated enormous scholarly debate throughout the centuries. The most plausible interpretation suggests that tragic poetry achieves a kind of emotional purification or clarification by evoking pity and fear in contexts that allow audiences to experience these emotions without the practical urgency that normally accompanies them. By witnessing the sufferings of characters like Oedipus or Antigone, audiences can explore the full range of human emotional response while remaining sufficiently detached to reflect on the causes and consequences of the actions represented. The analysis of plot structure reveals Aristotle's sophisticated understanding of narrative coherence and dramatic effectiveness. The best tragedies, he argues, involve characters who are neither perfectly virtuous nor utterly depraved, but possess the mixed character that typifies actual human beings. These characters encounter situations where their efforts to act well led inadvertently to disaster, often through some error of judgment or character flaw that makes their fate seem both inevitable and undeserved. The concepts of recognition and reversal provide additional insight into the logic of tragic plotting. Recognition occurs when characters discover previously unknown information about their identity, relationships, or circumstances. Reversal occurs when actions produce results opposite to those intended. The most effective tragedies combine these elements so that the moment of recognition coincides with the moment of reversal, creating the maximum emotional impact while revealing most clearly the connections between character, choice, and consequence. The discussion of character in tragedy reflects Aristotle's broader understanding of moral psychology and the relationship between individual excellence and social circumstances. Tragic heroes typically possess admirable qualities that make their eventual downfall genuinely pitiable, but they also display the kinds of moral and intellectual limitations that make their fate seem neither arbitrary nor inevitable. Through witnessing their struggles, audiences gain insight into both the possibilities and the limitations of human moral achievement. The brief discussion of comedy that survives suggests that Aristotle understood this dramatic form as serving complementary functions to tragedy. Where tragedy evokes pity and fear through the representation of serious actions with unfortunate outcomes, comedy evokes amusement through the representation of less serious actions that resolve happily, despite the errors and follies of the characters involved. Both forms contribute to practical wisdom by helping audiences understand the complex relationships between character, circumstance, and consequence that shape human experience. The integration of aesthetic, psychological, and moral considerations throughout the Poetics exemplifies the synthetic character of Aristotelian philosophy. Artistic creation is understood neither as mere entertainment nor as disguised instruction, but as a distinctive form of inquiry that contributes to human understanding through its particular methods of representation and analysis. Poetry serves the cause of wisdom by making visible patterns of human experience that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface complexity of actual events. The systematic investigation of theoretical, practical, and productive sciences developed throughout Aristotle's corpus rests on sophisticated analyses of knowledge, experience, and the methods through which human beings can achieve reliable understanding of themselves and their world. The epistemological foundations of the Aristotelian system are not presented in any single treatise, but emerge through careful attention to the methodological reflections scattered throughout his works, and to the principles that guide his actual investigative practice. The starting point for understanding Aristotelian epistemology is the recognition that human knowledge begins with sensory experience, but is not limited to it. Through perception, we encounter particular objects and events in their full concrete richness, but perception alone cannot provide the universal knowledge that constitutes genuine science. The transition from perception to knowledge requires intellectual activities that can grasp universal patterns within particular experiences and organize these patterns into systematic theoretical frameworks. The process through which universal knowledge emerges from particular experiences is analyzed most systematically in the posterior analytics, where Aristotle describes how induction enables us to move from repeated observations to reliable generalizations. When we observe that numerous individual men are capable of learning grammar, numerous individual horses are capable of rapid locomotion, and numerous individual plants are capable of photosynthesis, we can conclude through inductive reasoning that men as such are rational animals, horses as such are swift, and plants as such are capable of nutrition. This inductive process requires more than mere repetition of similar experiences. It involves the active work of intelligence in recognizing relevant similarities among different cases, abstracting from irrelevant differences, and formulating universal propositions that capture genuine causal connections rather than merely accidental correlations. The intellect that can perform this work possesses what Aristotle calls the capacity for nous, or intuitive grasp of first principles, without which no systematic science would be possible. The relationship between induction and deduction in Aristotelian methodology reflects his understanding of the circular or reciprocal character of inquiry at its best. Scientific investigation typically begins with inductive examination of particular phenomena, proceeds to the formulation of universal principles that can account for what has been observed, and then returns to particular cases to test whether the proposed principles actually succeed in explaining and predicting the phenomena under investigation. This methodological circle is not vicious but productive, since each stage of the process contributes distinctive insights that could not be achieved through either induction or deduction alone. Inductive investigation provides the empirical foundation without which theoretical principles would be empty abstractions. Deductive elaboration provides the systematic organization without which empirical observations would remain disconnected and scientifically useless. The integration of inductive and deductive methods reflects Aristotle's conviction that genuine knowledge must be both empirically grounded and rationally coherent. Sciences that lose contact with observational evidence become sterile exercises in logical manipulation, while investigations that fail to achieve theoretical integration remain at the level of mere data collection. The most fruitful scientific work maintains constant interaction between theoretical hypothesis and empirical testing. The analysis of different types of knowledge developed throughout Aristotle's works reveals his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cognitive capacities and their appropriate objects. Episteme, or scientific knowledge, deals with universal and necessary truths that can be demonstrated from first principles. Techne, or productive knowledge, deals with the methods for creating artifacts or achieving specific practical goals. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, deals with the variable and contingent domain of human action and social relationship. Each type of knowledge employs distinctive methods appropriate to its subject matter and serves different functions in human life. Scientific knowledge satisfies the natural human desire to understand the world simply for the sake of understanding. Productive knowledge enables us to shape our material environment to serve human needs and purposes. Practical knowledge guides us in the complex work of living well with others in political communities. The recognition that different types of inquiry require different methods reflects Aristotle's rejection of reductive approaches that attempt to model all knowledge on a single paradigm. The mathematical method appropriate for geometry cannot be applied successfully to ethics, nor can the dialectical method appropriate for political analysis be used effectively in biological classification. Methodological sophistication requires sensitivity to the distinctive logical requirements imposed by different subject matters. The emphasis on methodological diversity does not lead to skeptical conclusions about the possibility of objective knowledge. Aristotle maintains that reality itself exhibits the kind of rational structure that makes human inquiry both possible and potentially successful. The fact that we can discover universal patterns within particular experiences reflects the fact that nature itself operates according to intelligible principles. The fact that we can construct valid arguments from premises to conclusions reflects the fact that reality exhibits genuine logical relationships among its various components. This realistic conception of knowledge provides the foundation for Aristotle's confidence that systematic inquiry can achieve genuine understanding rather than merely useful constructions or conventional agreements. While human knowledge remains fallible and subject to revision in light of new evidence or deeper analysis, it can nevertheless attain objective truth about the structures and processes that constitute the natural and social worlds. The intellectual legacy of Aristotle achieved its most systematic development and extensive influence through the brilliant work of medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosophers, who translated, interpreted, and extended his teachings across more than 8 centuries of sustained scholarly investigation. This remarkable chapter in the history of human thought demonstrates both the universal appeal of Aristotelian insights and the creative possibilities that emerge when philosophical traditions encounter new cultural contexts and intellectual challenges. The process of transmission began in the 8th century when the Abbasid caliphs established translation schools in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning. Working from Greek manuscripts and Syriac intermediary translations, scholars like Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his associates produced Arabic versions of virtually the entire Aristotelian corpus, along with extensive commentaries by Alexander of Aphrodisias, Themistius, and other late ancient interpreters. These translations were not merely mechanical reproductions, but involved sophisticated philosophical interpretation, since many key Aristotelian concepts had no precise equivalents in Arabic and required creative theoretical development. The most influential of the Arabic commentators was Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who developed the first systematic integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology and political theory. Al-Farabi's perfect state adapted Aristotelian constitutional analysis to address the conditions under which Islamic political communities could achieve both religious righteousness and philosophical wisdom. His commentaries on logic established analytical methods that would influence Islamic jurisprudence for centuries, while his musical theory synthesized Aristotelian acoustics with the aesthetic traditions of Islamic culture. The work of al-Farabi prepared the way for the 2 greatest Arabic Aristotelians, Ibn Sina, known in Latin as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes. Avicenna developed a comprehensive philosophical system that integrated Aristotelian metaphysics with Neoplatonic emanation theory and Islamic theology, creating a synthesis of extraordinary scope and sophistication. His distinction between essence and existence, his analysis of necessary and contingent being, and his account of the relationship between universal and particular intellect would profoundly influence all subsequent medieval philosophy. Averroes, writing in Islamic Spain during the 12th century, produced the most systematic and philosophically acute commentaries on Aristotle ever written. His long commentary on the Metaphysics and his middle commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics demonstrate an understanding of Aristotelian argument that rivals that of Aristotle himself. Averroes defended the independence of philosophical inquiry against theological interference, while maintaining that properly understood philosophy and revelation address the same fundamental truths through different methods of investigation. The controversy surrounding Averroes's teachings, particularly his apparent denial of personal immortality and divine providence, led to the suppression of Aristotelian philosophy in the Islamic world, but paradoxically contributed to its flourishing in medieval Christian universities. The Latin translations of Averroes' commentaries, produced by scholars like Michael Scott and Hermann the German, introduced Christian thinkers to sophisticated methods of Aristotelian analysis that had been developed over 4 centuries of Islamic scholarship. The encounter between Aristotelianism and Christian theology reached its culmination in the work of Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologiae represents perhaps the most successful integration of philosophical and religious wisdom ever achieved. Aquinas showed how Aristotelian concepts of substance, causation, and teleology could illuminate central Christian doctrines while preserving both the rational character of philosophical inquiry and the revealed character of theological truth. His 5 ways for demonstrating the existence of God adapt Aristotelian causal analysis to provide rational foundations for religious belief, while his treatment of law and virtue synthesizes Aristotelian ethics with Christian moral theology. The Thomistic synthesis did not go unchallenged within the Christian tradition itself. Duns Scotus developed alternative metaphysical approaches that emphasize divine will over divine intellect and individual essence over universal nature. William of Ockham questioned the necessity of universal concepts and developed nominalistic approaches that would eventually undermine confidence in Aristotelian essentialism. These medieval debates established many of the fundamental issues that would continue to divide philosophers throughout the modern period. The Jewish tradition produced its own distinctive interpretations of Aristotelian philosophy, most notably in the work of Moses Maimonides, whose Guide for the Perplexed demonstrates how Jewish monotheism could be rationally defended through Aristotelian arguments while remaining faithful to biblical revelation. Maimonides' analysis of divine attributes, his treatment of prophecy, and his integration of philosophical ethics with Jewish law created a synthesis that influenced Jewish thought for centuries while contributing to the broader medieval conversation about the relationship between reason and faith. The medieval reception of Aristotle reveals both the extraordinary richness of his philosophical legacy and the creative possibilities that emerge when systematic thinkers encounter that legacy within their own cultural contexts. Islamic philosophers discovered in Aristotelian political theory resources for thinking about the relationship between philosophical wisdom and religious law. Christian theologians found in Aristotelian metaphysics conceptual tools for articulating doctrines about the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the relationship between divine and human nature. Jewish thinkers developed Aristotelian ethical theory to illuminate the relationship between intellectual perfection and moral excellence in the service of God. This creative appropriation of Aristotelian insights demonstrates that philosophical truth is not a static possession, but a living tradition that grows through engagement with new questions and challenges. The medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thinkers who wrestled with Aristotelian texts were not merely preserving ancient wisdom, but developing it in response to intellectual problems that Aristotle himself had not faced. Their work shows how philosophical inquiry can remain faithful to its sources while extending far beyond what those sources explicitly contain. The recovery of Aristotelian texts during the Renaissance, combined with new philological methods and changing cultural contexts, produced both renewed appreciation for the depth of Aristotelian insights and growing awareness of the limitations of medieval scholastic interpretations. Humanist scholars like Leonardo Bruni and George of Trebizond produced new Latin translations directly from Greek manuscripts, revealing aspects of Aristotelian thought that had been obscured by centuries of commentary and theological appropriation. The printing press made possible the first complete editions of Aristotle's works, beginning with the Aldine edition published in Venice in 1495 to 1498. These additions enabled scholars throughout Europe to study Aristotelian texts with unprecedented accuracy and completeness, leading to the recognition that many doctrines attributed to Aristotle by medieval commentators reflected later developments rather than the philosopher's actual teachings. The Renaissance recovery of Aristotelianism coincided with dramatic changes in natural philosophy that would eventually challenge fundamental features of the Aristotelian worldview. The astronomical observations of Copernicus, Brahe, and Galileo undermined confidence in Aristotelian cosmology, while the mechanical philosophy developed by Descartes, Hobbes, and others offered alternative approaches to understanding motion, causation, and the relationship between mind and body. Yet even as the scientific revolution called into question specific Aristotelian doctrines, it preserved and developed aspects of Aristotelian methodology that remain central to sophisticated inquiry. The emphasis on careful observation, systematic classification, and causal explanation that characterizes modern science reflects the influence of Aristotelian example, even when it rejects Aristotelian conclusions. The experimental method that Galileo pioneered can be understood as a refinement of Aristotelian inductionism adapted to the requirements of mathematical physics. The political philosophy of the early modern period similarly reveals both continuity and discontinuity with Aristotelian approaches. Thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke rejected Aristotelian assumptions about natural teleology and the inherent sociability of human beings, while preserving Aristotelian insights about the relationship between constitutional structure and political stability. The American founders drew extensively on Aristotelian analysis of mixed government while adapting it to the novel circumstances created by representative democracy and federalism. The moral philosophy of the modern period exhibits an even more complex relationship to the Aristotelian tradition. The deontological ethics developed by Kant explicitly rejects Aristotelian eudaimonism in favor of duty-based approaches that ground moral obligation in rational autonomy rather than human flourishing. Yet Kant's emphasis on the cultivation of character, his analysis of moral education, and his integration of individual and social perspectives echo central themes of Aristotelian ethical theory. The utilitarian tradition initiated by Bentham and Mill similarly departs from Aristotelian assumptions about the intrinsic value of virtuous activity, while preserving Aristotelian insights about the social dimensions of human flourishing. Mill's harm principle adapts Aristotelian analysis of justice to the conditions of modern liberal society, while his conception of higher and lower pleasures reflects Aristotelian recognition that different activities possess different degrees of intrinsic worth. The German idealist tradition, particularly as developed by Hegel, represents perhaps the most systematic modern attempt to preserve the synthetic and teleological character of Aristotelian philosophy, while adapting it to address the historical consciousness that distinguishes modern from ancient thought. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit can be read as an attempt to show how the Aristotelian conception of actualization operates not merely within individual substances, but throughout the historical development of human consciousness and social institutions. The 20th century witnessed a remarkable revival of interest in Aristotelian philosophy, stimulated by dissatisfaction with the analytical and existentialist traditions that had dominated early modern thought. Thinkers like Elizabeth Anscombe, Alasdair MacIntyre, and Philippa Foot developed sophisticated neo-Aristotelian approaches to ethics that recover the classical emphasis on virtue and human flourishing while addressing the challenges posed by moral disagreement and cultural diversity. The contemporary virtue ethics movement has drawn extensive inspiration from Aristotelian analysis of moral psychology, practical reason, and the relationship between individual excellence and social justice. Scholars like Rosalind Hursthouse, Julia Annas, and Nancy Sherman have shown how Aristotelian insights about habituation, the doctrine of the mean, and the role of emotions in moral judgment can illuminate contemporary debates about applied ethics, moral education, and the foundations of ethical theory. The revival of Aristotelian political philosophy has been equally impressive, with thinkers like Leo Strauss, Hannah Arendt, and Martha Nussbaum developing sophisticated interpretations of classical political wisdom that address contemporary concerns about democracy, human rights, and global justice. This work has shown how Aristotelian analysis of constitutional government, the rule of law, and civic education remains relevant to political challenges that Aristotle himself could not have anticipated. The scholarly investigation of Aristotelian philosophy during the past century has achieved levels of sophistication and precision that rival the great medieval commentaries, while benefiting from philological methods and historical consciousness unavailable to earlier interpreters. Modern editions of Aristotelian texts, based on systematic analysis of manuscript traditions and informed by deep understanding of ancient Greek language and culture, have provided scholars with resources for interpretation that enable new levels of accuracy and insight. The archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, particularly the recovery of papyrus fragments and the analysis of ancient libraries, have illuminated the historical context within which Aristotelian philosophy developed, while revealing the complexity of textual transmission that shaped the works we possess today. The recognition that most surviving Aristotelian texts represent lecture notes rather than finished treatises has transformed understanding of their argumentative structure and philosophical purpose. Contemporary interpreters have paid increasing attention to the systematic character of Aristotelian philosophy, showing how concepts and arguments developed in one domain illuminate problems addressed in apparently unrelated areas. The metaphysical analysis of substance and attribute clarifies the logical theory of predication. The psychological account of perception informs the ethical understanding of practical reason, and the political theory of constitutional government reflects the biological analysis of functional organization. This systematic approach has revealed the inadequacy of traditional divisions between theoretical and practical philosophy, showing how Aristotelian insights about the nature of reality inform his understanding of human action, while his analysis of human experience contributes to his metaphysical conclusions. The integration of scientific and ethical concerns that characterizes the best contemporary Aristotelian scholarship reflects recognition that these domains were never as separate in Aristotelian thinking as later philosophical traditions suggested. The question of teleology remains one of the most controversial aspects of contemporary Aristotelian interpretation. While few scholars defend the naive anthropocentric teleology that medieval thinkers sometimes attributed to Aristotle, many have argued for more sophisticated interpretations that preserve genuine insights about the goal-directed character of natural processes while remaining consistent with modern scientific understanding. The debate over biological teleology has been particularly fruitful, with philosophers of science like David Bohm, Alan Gotthelf, and James Lennox showing how Aristotelian functional analysis anticipates modern evolutionary approaches, while avoiding the crude externalism that characterizes some versions of intelligent design theory. Their work suggests that Aristotelian teleology is better understood as a sophisticated method for investigating the relationship between structure and function than as a substantive claim about cosmic purposes. The interpretation of Aristotelian ethics continues to generate scholarly debate about fundamental questions concerning the nature of virtue, the role of external goods in human flourishing, and the relationship between individual and social well-being. Scholars like John Cooper, Sarah Brawdy, and Richard Kraut have developed competing interpretations of eudaimonia that reflect different views about whether Aristotelian flourishing requires the successful exercise of all human capacities or can be achieved through excellent performance of our highest activities alone. The question of whether Aristotelian ethics is primarily egoistic or altruistic has received extensive attention, with interpreters like Julia Annis and Jennifer Whiting arguing for sophisticated accounts that transcend this traditional dichotomy by showing how genuine self-love requires concern for others and how authentic other regard contributes to the agent's own flourishing. These discussions have illuminated the social dimensions of Aristotelian virtue, while preserving recognition of the irreducible importance of individual character development. Contemporary political theorists continue to debate the relevance of Aristotelian constitutional analysis to modern democratic societies. Scholars like Stephen Solkover, Josiah Ober, and Gerald Mara have argued that Aristotelian insights about civic education, deliberative democracy, and the rule of law remain relevant to contemporary political challenges, while acknowledging the historical limitations of his assumptions about slavery, women's roles, and cultural diversity. The feminist critique of Aristotelian political theory has produced particularly fruitful results, with scholars like Susan Okin, John Bethke Elshtain, and Arlene Saxonhouse showing both the limitations of Aristotle's specific views about women and the resources within his broader theoretical framework for more adequate approaches to gender equality. Their work demonstrates how engagement with historical limitations can stimulate more sophisticated theoretical development. The application of Aristotelian insights to contemporary problems in bioethics, environmental philosophy, and international relations has revealed both the continuing relevance of classical approaches and the need for creative theoretical extension. Scholars like Leon Kass, Holmes Rolston III, and Sohail Hashmi have shown how Aristotelian concepts of human nature, natural purpose, and practical wisdom can illuminate contemporary debates while requiring significant development to address novel circumstances. The ongoing vitality of Aristotelian scholarship reflects not merely antiquarian interest, but recognition that the philosophical problems Aristotle addressed remain central to human intellectual and practical life. The questions he raised about the nature of reality, the conditions of knowledge, the foundations of ethics, and the requirements of political justice continue to challenge thoughtful people in every generation. The systematic rigor with which he approached these questions continues to provide models for philosophical investigation that combine empirical sensitivity with theoretical sophistication. The comprehensive investigation of Aristotelian philosophy, undertaken throughout this inquiry, reveals a systematic unity of extraordinary scope and enduring relevance. From the logical analysis of reasoning and language through the metaphysical investigation of being and causation, to the practical wisdom that guides ethical choice and political action, we encounter a philosophical vision that combines empirical sensitivity with theoretical sophistication, systematic comprehensiveness with methodological flexibility, and deep respect for the complexity of human experience with unwavering commitment to the possibility of rational understanding. The greatness of Aristotelian philosophy lies not in the particular doctrines he defended, many of which have been superseded by subsequent developments in science and scholarship, but in the approach he pioneered to the fundamental questions that continue to challenge human intelligence and practical wisdom. The conviction that reality exhibits rational structure accessible to systematic inquiry, the recognition that different domains of experience require different methodological approaches, the integration of theoretical and practical concerns within comprehensive philosophical frameworks. These methodological insights remain as relevant today as they were in 4th century Athens. The logical works establish the foundation for all systematic inquiry by analyzing the structures of language and thought that make possible the transition from particular experiences to universal knowledge. The categories reveals how our most basic conceptual distinctions reflect genuine features of reality rather than arbitrary linguistic conventions. The theory of syllogistic reasoning shows how valid inference preserves truth through formally correct transitions from premises to conclusions. The account of scientific demonstration specifies the conditions under which systematic sciences can achieve genuine explanatory understanding. These logical insights provide the methodological foundation for the metaphysical investigation of being qua being that constitutes first philosophy. The analysis of substance as the primary mode of being grounds all predication in genuine ontological relationships. The theory of potentiality and actuality explains how change and development are possible without undermining the stability required for rational investigation. The doctrine of the four causes shows how complete explanation must attend to material, formal, efficient, and final factors in their systematic interdependence. The philosophy of nature extends these metaphysical insights to illuminate the specific characteristics of beings subject to motion and change. The analysis of motion as actualization of potential explains how natural processes exhibit both regularity and directedness without requiring external intelligent guidance. The biological investigations demonstrate how systematic observation guided by theoretical frameworks can achieve genuine knowledge of the complex functional relationships that characterize living systems. The psychological treatises reveal how the concepts developed in natural philosophy can illuminate the distinctive features of beings capable of perception, desire, and rational thought. The hylomorphic analysis of soul and body shows how mental and physical processes can be distinguished without being separated into independent substances. The account of intellectual activity explains how individual human beings can achieve participation in universal truths that transcend the limitations of particular existence. The ethical investigation applies the insights of theoretical philosophy to address questions about human character, action, and flourishing. The analysis of virtue as excellence of character shows how natural human capacities can be shaped through education and habituation into stable dispositions for excellent activity. The doctrine of the mean demonstrates how practical wisdom guides the application of general moral principles to particular circumstances in their full complexity and contingency. The political philosophy extends ethical analysis to encompass the social conditions within which individual virtue develops and finds expression. The naturalistic approach to political community shows how human beings achieve their characteristic excellences only within institutions that provide appropriate frameworks for cooperative activity. The constitutional analysis demonstrates how theoretical insights about justice and practical wisdom can guide the construction of governmental arrangements that promote both individual flourishing and social stability. The investigation of rhetoric and poetry reveals how the productive sciences contribute to human understanding and appreciation through distinctive methods of representation and analysis. The theory of persuasion shows how effective communication must integrate logical, psychological, and aesthetic considerations in ways that serve the cause of truth while remaining sensitive to the conditions of actual human deliberation. The analysis of tragic poetry demonstrates how artistic representation can illuminate universal patterns of human experience through selective imitation of probable and necessary actions. This systematic integration of logical, metaphysical, scientific, ethical, political, and aesthetic investigations creates a philosophical framework of extraordinary comprehensiveness and coherence. Yet this systematic character does not represent a closed, dogmatic system that admits no development or revision. Rather, it provides conceptual tools and methodological approaches that remain productive for ongoing inquiry while remaining responsive to new empirical evidence and theoretical challenges. The medieval reception of Aristotelian philosophy by Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thinkers demonstrates the creative possibilities that emerge when systematic philosophical approaches encounter new cultural contexts and intellectual problems. The scholastic synthesis achieved by figures like Avicenna Averroes, Maimonides, and Aquinas shows how classical insights can be extended and developed without losing their essential character and systematic integrity. The modern critique of Aristotelian philosophy reveals both genuine limitations that require theoretical revision and misunderstandings that reflect inadequate appreciation for the sophistication of Aristotelian approaches. The scientific revolution undermined confidence in specific Aristotelian doctrines about the natural world while preserving and developing methodological insights that remain central to sophisticated scientific investigation. The political developments of the modern period challenge particular Aristotelian assumptions about social hierarchy and political participation, while confirming deeper insights about constitutional government, civic education, and the rule of law. The contemporary revival of Aristotelian philosophy reflects recognition that many supposedly modern problems have deep historical roots that repay careful philosophical investigation. The renewal of virtue ethics, the revival of metaphysical realism, the development of neo-Aristotelian approaches to philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. These developments demonstrate the continuing vitality of classical philosophical approaches when creatively adapted to address contemporary theoretical and practical challenges. The critical assessment of Aristotelian philosophy undertaken throughout this investigation reveals not obsolescence, but continuing capacity for creative development in response to new problems and possibilities. The limitations that modern scholarship has identified reflect not fundamental defects in Aristotelian method, but the inevitable constraints imposed by historical circumstances and the progressive character of human understanding. The environmental challenges facing contemporary societies require the kind of integrated approach that characterized Aristotelian philosophy at its best, combining detailed empirical investigation with normative reflection about the conditions of human and natural flourishing. The bioethical dilemmas created by advancing medical technology similarly require integration of scientific expertise with practical wisdom about the values and principles that should guide therapeutic intervention. The global political challenges of the 21st century, from climate change and economic inequality to cultural conflict and technological disruption, require theoretical frameworks that can integrate insights drawn from different domains of human knowledge while remaining grounded in careful analysis of contemporary conditions. The Aristotelian model of systematic investigation that combines empirical sensitivity with theoretical sophistication provides valuable guidance for such integrative work. The ultimate significance of Aristotelian philosophy lies in its demonstration that human reason, properly disciplined and systematically applied, can achieve genuine understanding of both the natural world and the conditions of human flourishing. The conviction that reality exhibits rational structure accessible to careful investigation, the recognition that theoretical and practical concerns are ultimately inseparable, the commitment to comprehensive understanding that honors both universal principles and particular circumstances. These insights remain as relevant today as they were 24 centuries ago. We conclude then with recognition that Aristotelian philosophy represents not a historical curiosity, but a living tradition that continues to offer resources for addressing the fundamental questions that challenge every generation of thoughtful human beings. The systematic integration of scientific investigation and ethical reflection, the commitment to comprehensive understanding that transcends disciplinary boundaries, the conviction that careful reasoning can illuminate both the structure of reality and the conditions of human excellence. These features of the Aristotelian approach remain indispensable for anyone seeking to understand our place in the natural order and our responsibilities to one another as rational and social beings. In the end, Aristotle's greatest achievement may be his demonstration that philosophy at its best serves not merely academic curiosity, but the deepest human need for understanding that can guide both theoretical investigation and practical choice. The The architecture of reality, reason, and human flourishing that emerges from systematic engagement with Aristotelian insights provides a framework within which subsequent generations can continue the never-ending work of inquiry that defines our humanity and directs us toward wisdom, virtue, and the common good that encompasses both individual excellence and social justice.